1, 2, 3 judges present and accounted for, which means we can officially start. Well, good morning, everybody. Officially, my name is Emily Voss. I am the We the People coordinator for Virginia. Welcome to North Carolina's We the People team, and congratulations for being here at Nationals. We're looking forward to seeing your presentation today. In just a second, I'll have your judges introduce themselves, and then they'll ask you to introduce yourselves and your coach. And from there, you all know the drill. They will read you the question, which will not surprise you, is question 2. And then you all can proceed with your prepared statement, and we'll do some follow-up questions from there. So have a great time, everybody. It's going to be a good conversation. Let me hand it to your judges.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Emily, and welcome, North Carolina. It's great to see you. We will, as Emily said, introduce ourselves and move on from there. So my name is Joe Stewart. I teach at Clemson University in the other Carolina and make it up I-85 with some frequency to the medical center up at Duke. So I'm close by your school on a fairly regular basis. Relax. We're going to have fun. I know your teacher, Ms. Klein, very well, and I'm sure she's prepared you. We need to learn from you. I'm sure we can.
I'm Mike Miles from Birmingham, Alabama. One of my closest friends is the county attorney here in Jefferson County, and he's a graduate of North Carolina. So whenever North Carolina's playing basketball on TV, especially if they're playing the Dukies, as he calls them, I have to watch the game from my house with him, and we comment back and forth. And he thinks that Mike Krzyzewski is the devil incarnate, and he's glad that Roy Williams retired. And so I'm very current on events in North Carolina, at least in the winter and spring of the year. I always have to take his teams in my bracket, or I get in real trouble with him. So I know that there's Hayden. I know there's a whole lot more to North Carolina than basketball, I guess. And so I'm looking forward to spending time with this bunch this morning. Thanks.
I'm Donald Rogers. I taught history at Central Connecticut State before I retired recently. I've been part of We the People for many years. It's a great program. You should really be honored and happy that you're part of it. My observation of students that go through We the People, they do great things later on. This is a good sign. And I look forward to hearing your comments and have a good conversation for you. So relax and give us the best you got. Good.
Okay, please introduce yourselves and your teacher.
Hello, my name is Matteo Santoiani.
I'm Parker Rowan.
I'm Hayden Young.
Hi, I'm Reagan Hurley. We're all students at Raleigh Charter High School. Ms. Klein is our teacher.
Okay, great. I noticed Ms. Klein is hiding from me now. So, okay, we're doing question 2, as Emily suggested. So I'll read the question for posterity's sake here. It's a quote from a letter written by John Adams. There is nothing I dread so much as a division of the republic into 2 great parties, each arranged under its leader and in opposition to each other. What issues led to the formation of the original political parties? To what extent have those issues persisted in American political parties? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a unified or divided government? You may begin.
The original political parties arose from conflicts over the role of the federal government, America's relationship with the world, and the balance of agrarian and industrial interests. The Federalist Party, led by then Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, was the first to form. The party's early supporters were those who favored his controversial financial plan, which would shift the U.S. towards mercantilism, the creation of a federal mint, national banking, and the imposition of protective tariffs to aid American manufacturers. The Federalists also heavily supported a strong central government and a broad reading of the Constitution, especially the Necessary and Proper Clause.
The Federalists favored an alliance with Britain due to its close ties with American trade and political stability. The Federalists were met with fierce opposition from immigrants settled in the southern and western U.S. who disliked their pro-industrial policies and their advocacy for a strong central government.
This sentiment led to the formation of the Democratic Republican Party under the leadership of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. The party ardently opposed Hamilton's financial plan, especially the creation of a national debt. They were also deeply dismayed by the Federalist ties to Britain, as Jefferson was worried that the British aristocracy would ultimately come to undermine the newly established Republican government.
Several of the issues that formed the Federalist and the Democratic Republican Party still persist in our modern party system. For example, there is a significant divide over the role of the federal government in the everyday lives of Americans. The modern Republican Party heavily favors limited government and minimal governmental spending. As Ronald Reagan once said, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. Democrats, in stark contrast, tend to support a more active government in the adoption of large governmental policies such as the 2010 Affordable Care Act and other social programs.
The divide over foreign policy that helped to create the first party system also continues to define our modern political parties. For example, the issue of immigration. Republicans generally oppose amnesty for undocumented immigrants and favor increased funding of border protection. Democrats, however, favor the creation of a path to citizenship for certain immigrants and fewer restrictions on American borders. Democrats also tend to favor decreased military spending and, unlike their Republican counterparts, diplomatic solutions to conflicts with enemies like Iran.
The persistence of the two-party system in the United States has created periods of both unified and divided governments. Divided government often arises due to our bicameral legislature, structural divisions of legislative and executive powers, and staggered term lengths. Unlike in many parliamentary systems, elected lawmakers do not appoint executive officials, and one party rarely controls all aspects of government.
This creates gridlock and inhibits the government's ability to react to crisis. An example of this is the frequent governmental shutdowns that occur as opposing parties in Congress fail to agree upon a national budget in a timely manner. Despite such disadvantages, a divided government nonetheless serves as a check on the government's power and ensures that laws are only passed when there is a broad bipartisan consensus.
During periods of unified government, the US functions more like a parliamentary system. Unified government, such as one found with the United Kingdom, lacks the safeguards of divided government, as the House of Commons controls who is elected to become prime minister, who may then appoint cabinet members without checks. As a result, unified governments can quickly pass popular legislation and react decisively in times of crisis. However, this often comes with the suppression of minority interests and the looming possibility of a tyrannical majority. Thank you.
Thank you. You talked about the difference between the parties as being, and I'll oversimplify and correct me if I misstate your position, the difference between limited government and expanded government. But then some of the examples that you give are things like the Republicans being in favor of limited government, except they want stronger immigration enforcement, more military spending. Is that limited government versus an active government really the difference between the two parties? Or is it that what the government does really differentiates?
I would argue that it is both. They differ in terms of rhetoric. The Republican Party readily argues for a limited government and smaller government spending. However, when they control Congress or when they control the presidency, although social programs and welfare programs often are under attack by them, they also support increased military spending at times. But even then, the Republican Party is a broad blanket which covers many different ideologies and viewpoints, and as a result, there are many who are libertarians that exist underneath the Republican Party who argue even further slashes much to government spending and limited government authority within state matters should occur.
Limited versus expanded government is a large portion of what divides both parties. It isn't the only one, but I do think that it is a major portion of it, because what the Republican Party is generally arguing is not necessarily expanding the powers of the government, merely strengthening the powers that it already has.
Sometimes we take structural things for granted because they just have been such a part of us for so long that may have hidden effects that we don't think about. You're fortunate to live in a state that's really a two-party state. You have a governor of one party, but you have United States senators, or at least one of other parties. And that's not true in my state because the Republican Party is going to win the presidential vote in our state. Even in the Democratic primary, the candidates rarely come here, and it makes the Democratic Party weaker and weaker, and the statewide candidates can't win, and so the Democratic Party fades. If the Electoral College nationwide, let's just assume that we're stuck with it forever. If the Electoral College nationwide was more like Nebraska and Maine, where the electoral votes were awarded by congressional district, every congressional district, whoever carried that district would get that vote, or that legislate, what would that make all the states more competitive? Would it make the political parties more competitive in each state than they are right now? Or is it just that elections have consequences and every party's got to tend to themselves in their own state?
I would
I'm sorry. Go
argue,
ahead.
I would argue that for the case of implementing awarding electoral votes by congressional district, that falls prey to something. It falls prey to gerrymandering, which I would argue is a big problem in terms of awarding votes by congressional districts, as it would ensure that if one party has control over the state legislator and they are in the charge of the ones redistricting, they are the ones who can essentially make that state lean to one side or another and ensure that that state, the majority of the electoral votes, is awarded to their choice of presidential candidate.
Yeah.
Of course, that would be different if there is safeguards in place, like an independent bipartisan or nonpartisan commission that would redistrict in terms of with impartiality and fairly, rather than the state legislators doing that.
Assuming that the districts aren't horribly gerrymandered, like they have been in North Carolina a few times throughout history, I feel like the aggregate effect of such a system, like as you see in Nebraska, would make the Electoral College turn out to be more or less similar to the popular vote, which would in effect make more rural states, and which are on average more Republican states, weaker and less represented in the national presidential election.
Interesting. Thank you, Dr. Owen.
So looking at the course of American history, are there occasions when the American political party system has failed? And does it matter whether this was preceded by unified or divided government?
Well, one period where the two-party system has failed is during the 1820s and what's known as the era of good times, when the Federalist Party is essentially almost destroyed and its voting base scattered, with the Democratic Party being the only real party that is in power and has candidates that are running. Of course, during that, and that was precipitated by the expansion westward, as the Federalists ardently opposed a westward expansion, as expansion westward would increase the Democratic Republican Party's voting base.
I feel it's hard to say when each party, the two-party system, has failed or succeeded, rather than the parties agreeing or disagreeing with each other. After World War II, the veterans of World War II, they became politicians, and when they were in Congress, they had this shared experience of the war, and they got more things done because they were more unified in their policies because of the things that they have gone through. But with these veterans stepping out of office now due to old age or just retirement, these new people are coming in without these shared experiences. And I think that that's making the parties themselves more polarized and not as effective.
You, when you talk about divided government, you talked about the division between the legislative and executive branches. Should we consider the judicial branch as in our consideration of divided government, and why or why not?
I would say no, because the way at least the Supreme Court in the US is, it's the weakest branch. It can't enforce its own decisions, and it relies heavily upon the executive to enforce its decisions. So if there's a disagreement between the executive and the legislative making the laws the court reviews, and the executive enforcing the court's decisions about the laws, I think you can exclude judicial review from talks of divided government.
In addition to that, the Supreme Court has generally, as well as the federal courts and state courts, have generally have attempted to stay, to not be political and not take one side or another in terms of party stances. And an example of that is the Supreme Court refusing to rule on controversial social issues such as gay marriage or abortion, which means that which they have refused to do in an attempt to remain unpolitical.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Okay, well, good. We want to give you a few comments about your presentation today. I like the way you started off with a kind of a multifaceted approach to the origins of political parties. That it wasn't just one thing, but a multiple dimensions, which of course makes it more complicated to analyze. I also like the fact that you pointed out that some of the differences between parties are rhetorical. It's how they present themselves, perhaps at times more than what the actual differences are. Wish we'd had more time to discuss third parties and what role they play and why we don't have more of them. You mentioned the libertarians, and that should have been another jumping off point for our discussion, except Emily is very strict with us about not letting us spend more time. I, of course, was shocked that someone from North Carolina would start talking about gerrymandering.
Oh, shocked.
Who would have imagined that you would consider gerrymandering an issue in your state? As I drive up I-85 periodically and remember that old 12th district where, of course, now I couldn't have a blowout run across the median and into the other lane because of all the construction on I-85. And I also like, in response to one of the questions, and in response to my colleague's question about adopting the Maine or Nebraska model, you correctly pointed out the urban-rural differences that perhaps harken back to the regional differences that you had mentioned in the early period of time. So I thought you just did a very good job, very well prepared. And thank you for an enjoyable discussion.
Yeah, Joe, I was thinking about historical, in a previous group, when somebody mentioned the era of good feeling, Dr. Stewart suggested that I lived through the era of good feeling. No, I was not alive then. He just likes to say that I was. Mateo, on my gallery view, you're in the middle of the top row of my gallery view, and Emily is in the middle of the middle row. And when you were finishing up there and she held up the time card and you kind of leaned to one side, it looked like you were leaning around her card to finish your answer. And I was wanting to say, go, man, go ahead, finish your answer. I want to hear. Emily, you're in the perfect spot. You're in the Paul Lind square of the gallery view here, which is probably a good spot for you to be in. But Mateo, I'm glad you finished. Reagan, you included a quote in your part that is probably quintessential Ronald Reagan quote of all time about government, being the problem. That's what he said. And I got to ask, did your parents name you for President Reagan, or is that a family name?
Yeah, they did name me after him, actually.
I had to wonder when you used that quote, I had to wonder if that was the case.
Yeah.
A lot of people felt very strongly that he was right, that it was. A lot of people felt very strongly that he wasn't. And the people that I know, if they were comfortable with their position in life, wanted government out of their business. There's too many people in my state who need Medicaid and who need mental health funding and that kind of thing. And too many people in my state think that the government has done enough for everybody. But as long as there are people hurting, I don't know about that. The last thing I would say to you is that you are fortunate to live in a state. I was struck as you came up on the screen with the remarkable people that have held public office in your state on both parties, in both parties, from both parties, however you ought to say that. And I guess what I'd say to you is, because I could tell that y'all each had your own different views about things, get in one of them. Political parties are terrible. They're gross. I've been in one. I was an elected official in one. I was on the state executive committee of my party. I've been the chair of the county committee of my party. I hate them. They're terrible. There's more problem than good to them. Get in one of them. Join one of them, because they're the people that run the train. They're the people that elect the officials that are going to make the decisions, he and she, that are going to make the decisions that affect so many people in your state, or the state that you wind up in. If you go off to a university and stay in that state, they're going to make the decisions in that one. Get in one of them, get involved, get prominent, and you're not going to fix it. I think it's too hard to fix. Dr. Rogers is right. Parties let the people down more than they succeed, but hopefully over the time they do more good than bad. So get in them and be a part of fixing some of these things, and let the quotes in future years come from leaders like you, rather than leaders who have failed us in the past. And we will enjoy watching your careers as we enjoyed watching you this morning. Shane, we could see you in all four of them this morning. We could see your influence in them, and it was fun to watch. Thank you.